I'm truly grateful for the hours I know you've put into this essential transparency process and into the work that you do to support Territorians every single day in all the facets of their life. I only wish that we could table all your big binders that you brought in so that a much greater level of transparency could be achieved. And once again, I'm sorry that so many of you did not get to share your work with Territorians. And also thanks to my fellow committee members, to our chair and the other people that came into the chair role, a sterling job, and of course to the DLA and committee secretariat staff. Your work is astounding. The amount that you do across all the committees and across these 2 weeks it's excellent, it's reliable, it's appreciated, you're amazing. I also want to thank my staff and incredible volunteers who work for me. As the independent shadow minister for everything, it's a huge job to be across every single portfolio. And so the people that support me in getting across that, the amount of work and effort that they put into this on behalf of our constituents and the Territory is incredibly appreciated. And also thank you to all the people outside this chamber who I know followed along with estimates, who sent in questions, who engaged deeply with this process because they care deeply about the Northern Territory. This is the People's House, and I feel inspired and hopeful by the number of people who contacted me because they care so much about what we're doing in here. Every question that I didn't get time to ask, I will put in as a written question. So public servants, all your work, all your preparation and all your thick binders will not be wasted. Madam Speaker, budget estimates is one of the most important accountability processes we have in this parliament. We have 60 hours, believe me, I know, to ask questions, and it's one of the few opportunities for elected representatives to actually sit down with ministers and senior public servants and ask a simple question. What are you doing with Territorians' money, and is it actually improving Territorians' lives? It's not a partisan question, it's not a political question, it's the most basic responsibility for any parliament. And as my fellow committee members have said, after being present for every minute of 2 weeks of estimates, I've come away with deep concerns. Not because I heard things that I disagreed with, not because I think government should never make difficult decisions, but because again and again we were told that there are critical areas of government where there is no clear plan, no meaningful evaluation, no way of measuring success, and in some cases no way for Territorians to actually know whether the money that's being spent in their name is achieving what it's supposed to achieve. Madam Speaker, our constituents deserve better than that. If the government is spending public money, our money, we should know what outcomes we're trying to achieve. And if the government's making major policy decisions, we should know what evidence supports them. If we're investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, we should know whether those investments are working. This is a minimum standard of transparency and accountability that Territorians should expect from any government, and throughout estimates, a consistent pattern emerged. When asked about evidence, the tone was set on day one when I asked the Chief Minister, was any specific evidence relied on in developing these bills? And she replied, "This is so old news, Member for Johnston. Your style is incredibly predictable." Yep, you got me, Chief Minister. I will keep asking about evidence. I will keep asking about evaluation. I will keep asking about how the government is making decisions and spending all of our money. Instead, what we were told over and over again is that evidence is about election commitments, and the data, the measurement about whether things are working doesn't exist, or that we couldn't see it. When we were asked about plans, we were told either they didn't exist, we couldn't see them, or they're still being developed. And when we were asked about how decisions are made, too often the answer was simply trust us. Territorians deserve more than trust. They deserve evidence, they deserve transparency, and they deserve accountability. Madam Speaker, let me start with justice. For 2 years, Territorians have been told that tougher laws would make communities safer, yet when I asked what evidence underpinned major changes to bail laws, youth justice laws and the criminal code, the answer was not research, evidence or evaluation, but that Territorians voted for them, and that is not evidence. It's entirely possible for a policy to be popular and ineffective at the same time. If the CLP genuinely cares about reducing crime, it should be measuring whether these policies are actually working. Yet Treasury has undertaken no long-term modelling of what investing in prevention could mean compared with investing in prisons. No modelling of whether earlier intervention would reduce offending. No modelling of the long-term costs borne by future generations. Madam Speaker, the same pattern emerged across every portfolio. In housing, we heard that there's little evidence of a comprehensive plan to address the huge scale of need in housing, which affects every aspect of Territorians' lives. When we look at children and families, we heard that the intensive therapeutic out-of-home care costs around $750,000 per child per year, the median cost for a house, that the Minister couldn't tell us how many women and children are turned away from domestic, family and sexual violence crisis accommodation, that funding increases promised to frontline domestic violence services had still not reached providers with only weeks remaining in the financial year. Madam Speaker, how can we know whether services are meeting demand if we do not measure unmet demand, and how can we know if investments are working if promised funding is not reaching the front line? We heard, incredibly concerningly, that the Attorney-General could not say whether she had met with, received advice from or acted on recommendations from the Children's Commissioner. Madam Speaker, the Children's Commissioner exists to advocate for vulnerable children, and part of her statutory role is to advise the Minister. If the CLP truly cares about protecting children, listening to the independent office established to protect children's interests would be a good place to start. And when I asked to speak directly to the commissioners who were sitting there at the table, the Attorney-General said, "I'm the Minister and I'll decide who speaks." This is a deeply concerning attitude towards independent statutory officers. In health, the same questions arise. We couldn't hear what proportion of the health budget is spent on prevention. The only figure provided was around 1%. If the CLP genuinely cares about improving health outcomes, it should know how much is being spent on preventing illness before it occurs, because every preventable illness means a healthier Territorian and a more sustainable health system. Madam Speaker, we saw the same disconnect between spending policy and evidence in schools. When asked what evidence supported fining parents and children to improve school attendance, the Minister said whether evidence exists or not, it was an election commitment. Madam Speaker, millions of dollars are being spent on a program with no evidence, no program evaluation, and where attendance rates are dropping. What is the plan? When asked about support for Creole-speaking students, the Minister couldn't identify any and described Creole as broken English. Madam Speaker, Creole is a recognised language, the second most language spoken in the Northern Territory, with at least 11 schools having all students speaking Creole as their first language. Madam Speaker, we learned that 65% of Territory Generation's investments are currently in gas, but when asked to provide modelling showing how investment decisions are made, including decisions about renewable, we were told that it could not be provided. Madam Speaker, we heard that the Department of Mining and Energy couldn't say whether fossil fuels represent the cheapest energy option because the modelling hasn't been done. If the CLP genuinely cares about keeping power affordable, it should be undertaking that work urgently, of working out what is the cheapest, most effective, most sustainable way for Territorians to have a power source. The same lack of planning is evident in environmental policy, no strategic plan for the Beetaloo Basin. Cumulative effects will be measured at the end, after they've all happened, when it's too late to fix up any harm that might have been done. And one of the most disturbing themes was what we learned about accountability itself. The Territory can't track how GST funding spent, nearly half of our revenue. The Territory Coordinator can't provide a list of who the office has met with. Key conflict of interest information relating to the EPA is not available. The NT ranked last out of 12 jurisdictions in the 2025 Audited Independence Report. The Auditor General, the independent officer who's responsible for auditing government spending, cannot fully examine whether public money is achieving what it's supposed to achieve. Madam Speaker, I wasn't expecting perfection in estimates, but I was expecting to get answers. And when we have a Minister that answers questions about what framework they use to develop laws with, the formal framework I adhere to is the one that Territorians elected us to do, which is to restore the Territory lifestyle, as the Attorney-General did, we should all be very worried. Governments might plan for the 4-year electoral cycle, but the rest of us here are here for the long term, Madam Speaker, and that's what we want planning for. Not for the next election, but for all of our children and our grandchildren.